What the challenger in WWF, the challenger, Zach from Apologetics. We'll give you the floor first, man. Tell everybody where they can find you. Anything you got coming up.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Oz. Looking forward to this debate. My name is Zach. I have a YouTube channel podcast called Here in Apologetics. Looks a lot like philosophical issues, especially like from the perspective of Christian worldview. So I talk with like philosophers, scientists, theologians, apologists about all big questions related to like philosophy of religion and all those big things. So it's a lot of fun. So you can check out the YouTube channel or podcast, and you can see a lot of interviews with a lot of people a lot smarter than me, and we talk about all kinds of things.
Awesome. Thank you. And, are you a rapper?
A what?
A rapper?
A rapper? I mean, I wish I was, but no, I'm not a rapper.
You said all that really fast, so I was just wondering.
I talk fast, so you're gonna be in for a little bit of a ride.
Yeah, he would have one up on Twista for sure.
about just threw a beat up for him. Let him go. And next, the UDC tournament champion, the one and only Godless Engineer. What you got going on, man? Good to see you.
Hi. Well, let's see. Tomorrow night, I'm actually hosting The Line, where anybody that wants to call in and give me shit can. I'm going to be doing that tomorrow. Monday, I've got a video that's going to be coming out where I'm responding to a Catholic friar who has an open letter to atheists. And then on Wednesday, we have another video going out where a guy says that atheism shouldn't exist. So we got a lot of stuff coming up on the channel, as well as our Bible podcast and, probably some clips from various call-in shows that I've done. So, it's always a full week over there on the GE channel, which is Godless Engineer here on YouTube or any other social media platform, except for Facebook. Somebody had already taken the Godless Engineer name, and so it's Godless Engineering on Facebook. But everywhere else, it's Godless Engineer if you want to look me up.
Yes, sir. And then he does have an app, and I'll pull it up in between rounds and so you guys can see it on the screen. But it's called Crestus, and if you haven't downloaded it, the fuck are you waiting for? No, I'm just kidding. Go download it. And then last but not least, our guest referee for this event, Shane the Skeptic. If you want to tell everybody where to find you, and then we'll get this thing going.
Yep, you look up Shane the Skeptic on YouTube or on Facebook, you'll find me. My YouTube channel has counter apologetics, debunking, critical thinking, discussion, stuff like that. I recently started adding to my Facebook page sort of deductive arguments or quick breakdowns and pictures of here are the tactics of presuppositional apologists and stuff like that. So if you're interested in debating or just learning more about critical thinking, look me up on Facebook or YouTube.
Awesome. Can you guys pull my screen up? I share my screen. I have a little bit of a slideshow. Splendid. Are we gonna start whenever? Are we just getting into this?
Yeah, just jump in. I got the clock.
Alrighty, sounds good. Okay, so I'll start. Thank you so much to the Atheist Roundtable for hosting this debate. John agreeing to do this should be a lot of fun. And thanks to Kyle Volmar, Tim Howard, Jono, everyone else that kind of helped me bouncing ideas off in preparation of this debate. So let's get into it. Does God exist? If I can switch my slides, we'll get it going. What do I mean by God? So I think if you push me further, I'd say that God is a perfect being, a maximally great being. But my definition for this debate is a necessary mind that created the universe. Here's what basically the basic overview of why I think theism is simpler than the hypothesis of hard atheism. The claim that there is no God and what the foundations would result in that. So stage one is hopefully we can all agree that there's some sort of necessary fact grounding reality. This can be your quantum realm, your energy, matter, whatever. I'd say it's a mind. And then stage two is I'm going to say that a mind-like foundation, a theistic explanation, God, explain the data better than an indifferent material foundation with things like in design, arbitrary limits, more knowledge and reason, the intuitiveness of theism, and mental states. So stage one, there is a necessary fact. So this is just a basic contingency argument developed by Alexander Proust. Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology is a great place to go. Every contingent fact has an explanation. This is the principle of sufficient reason, which says that things that could have been otherwise, like me and this table and this chair, have explanations. So it's a very established principle, I think, in philosophy, where you say every contingent fact has an explanation. So I have an explanation through my parents. This table has an explanation from the factory, like that. There'd be a contingent fact that includes all other contingent facts. So let's say that there's a contingent fact of me talking to this computer right now, seeing these people on the screen. So there's a multiple contingent facts here. We have my existence, which is dependent on my parents, the computer, which is dependent on the Apple factory, and things along the like. I think we can also form a big conjunctive contingent fact, the BCCF, which is a contingent fact that contains all contingent facts, think that all things that could have been otherwise. You could say this is like everything that would exist in maybe like the universe. So there's a big conjunctive contingent fact, and there'd be an explanation of this fact because contingent facts have explanations. Is backed by the first premise. So there'd be an explanation of this entire fact where we have all of contingencies, and this fact would involve a necessary fact. This is something that couldn't have been otherwise. It exists because it had to, and it'd be responsible for things like the universe, you and me. As an atheist, I hope this is a place where we can build bridges, because you could say, hey, this is maybe like the quantum scalar vacuum field or matter energy, something like this. Like Graham Oppy, greatest atheist philosopher alive, would agree up to 4 and say, yeah, I agree there's a necessary fact, and that would be the initial state of the universe. And this necessary being is God is what I'm going to defend for the next 8 minutes. So stage 2 is 5 reasons to think that this necessary fact is a mind. First, theism explains design. A difference does not. Premise 1, if God exists, design aligned for embodied moral agents would be expected. This is defended because a perfect being would want to share his love. I see no reason why a God wouldn't want to like have other creatures to share communion with him, but the foundation is different. There is no reason to expect a world that is ordered in a way to allow for embodied moral agents. There's many different ways that the universe could have gone, where maybe no life exists, or very primitive life that can't like make rational moral decisions. Embodied moral agents exist. That's you and me. Therefore, God probably exists. This is just like a Bayesian inductive argument saying the probability of fine tuning is higher on theism than like a naturalistic atheism. So it seems like this is evidence in favor of theism. And there's examples of fine tuning, like we talk about like early universe conditions with like the initial entropy of the universe with Roger Penrose, like gravity, things like that. And there's also like intuitive arguments we can make where like if a personal mind is a necessary fact, an intelligent design universe would be expected, but given indifference, there's no reason to think that the universe would appear to be designed for embodied moral agents. I also have some objections. If you want to pause and get through some of the slides as we progress, feel free to pause and catch up. I'm not going to be able to get through everything here. Second reason to think that the foundation is a mind. Indifference probably poses arbitrary limits, whereas theism not. So premise 1, the necessary fact does not depend on any further explanation for its existence. This is hence to be necessary. So whether it's the quantum vacuum or matter energy, things like that, these things are not going to have the necessary fact doesn't have a further explanation for its existence. It exists because it had to. There is no further progression on the chain of explanation, whereas arbitrary limits probably do have further explanations. Arbitrary limits are things, they're quantities of things that could have been different. This can apply to like atoms, particles, energy, other material objects. For example, if we're going to say the necessary fact is something that's like material, we could ask, well, maybe why is there 500 particles instead of 501 or 499? It seems like this cries out for a further explanation. Therefore, the necessary fact is probably something without arbitrary limits, because we have if we have a picture of the foundation with limits, and whereas like a foundational mind would not have these arbitrary limits. So it seems, at least in that respect, the theistic explanation of a mind being foundational without these arbitrary limits would be a simpler hypothesis, because I don't have to add these brute arbitrary limits. Josh Rasmussen and How Reason Can Lead to God says all limits alike have an outside explanation upon which they depend, yet the basic features of the foundation, by contrast, lack an outside explanation. Therefore, the basic features of the foundation have no limits. The third argument is the arguments through moral knowledge and reason. An argument for reason. Necessary fact is either a mind or it's not a mind. The law of excluded middle. If the foundation is not a mind, it's unlikely that reason would emerge. Reason exists. Therefore, the necessary fact is probably a mind. And by reason, I mean the power to think, understand, and make judgments. So if hard atheism is true, there is no God, the foundation is something that's probably material. Your decision to believe in God or not ultimately is.
Zach, you cut out for a second. Could you kind of repeat what you said, maybe like the last sentence or two?
Sure. So you saw like 1 through 3 in the argument, 1 through 4 in the argument?
Okay. Just like the last sentence you said or something like that kind of cut out.
Okay, my apologies. So reason is the power to think, understand, and make judgments. So if hard atheism is true and the foundation is something materialistic, your decision to believe in God or not ultimately isn't based on your own power to make judgments, but rather the fundamental laws God governing the universe. So you could say like, well, my beliefs are based off of like maybe like my brain. Well, what determines your brain? Well, you're going to have something further like the laws of physics. Sorry, my slides went off. I was like funky for a second. An argument for moral knowledge. If evolutionary naturalism is true, moral knowledge is probably a product of our evolutionary history. If the necessary fact is a mind, it could provide a rational, a reliable way for us to have moral knowledge through creating rational features.
My fault. Continue.
You're good. So I'm good to go. Okay. So premise 3, moral knowledge exists. This is the ability to say, hey, we can maybe know what's right and wrong and rationally deduce this. Therefore, the necessary fact is probably a mind. So for example, 40% of sexual intercourse among ducks is forced, which is probably a product of their evolutionary history. So my question then for John would be, is it possible that we would evolve in a way where something like forced sexual intercourse is an acceptable behavior? Because it seems like if moral knowledge is the product of our evolutionary history, then it seems like that's totally a possible scenario. I was just talking with an atheist on TikTok, and he was kind of coming to that same exact scenario. But if the necessary fact is mind, we could rationally kind of decide these moral truths, and not decide, but to understand them. here's a meme because I realized was going to talk really fast and it's going to take a while. So philosophy is great. Fourth, the existence of God is intuitively obvious to many people. It seems intuitive to most people that God exists. Not all people. I grant that not everyone thinks it's intuitive, but most people. And there's no good reason to think that God is non-existent or non-present. Therefore, God probably exists. So a couple questions here. Is it intuitive to most people? Well, I have a couple studies here you can look at where it shows that it's natural for most humans to believe in some sort of God, and even like professional scientists from like Harvard, MIT, Yale, etc., have this same like intuition. So why should we trust intuition? I think that's the good question here. Well, we have many beliefs that we hold to, such as like the reliability of our cognitive faculties, the external world, the existence of other minds, which can't be proven to be true. But since they seem to be true and there's no defeaters, it seems rational to conclude that it's probably the case. I can't prove to you that other minds exist, but it seems rational given what I know. There's no good defeaters for this proposition. Finally, the existence of the mental points to a mental foundation. So if the necessary fact is a mind, the existence of other minds would be likely. There's like the whole argument from material causality from Felipe Leon. Well, if there's minds, it seems like there's no problem if the existence of minds would be best explained by a foundational mind. But if the necessary fact is something material, the existence of genuine mental properties is unlikely. I'm talking about mental properties that don't just reduce to physical properties. Genuine mental properties exist, therefore the necessary fact is probably a mind. Another Bayesian argument here. Now I have a couple objections here. It's really small text, but it's like, doesn't consciousness just emerge from the brain? Well, I'd say that an emergent mind seems pretty similar to substance dualism, and the physicalists must show why the evidence supports their theory and not something like panpsychism or idealism with regards to the mind. So there's a lot of times we'll hear like, oh, well, there's the brain and mind correlation, which is fine. But if you look at something like panpsychism, where there's atheists like say like David Chalmers, who would be a panpsychist, we have consciousness that kind of like just fundamentally embedded into reality as itself. So I'd be curious with John, if he is a physicalist, why he thinks that the evidence supports physicalism and not panpsychism. So why I think genuine mental properties exist? Well, we can locate physical events. We can't locate another person's consciousness. Consciousness is irreducible, not able to be quantified. Mental states have intentionality. You're able to introspect on your own existence. Physical states can't do this. I quoted a study here with split brain studies because I see this a lot where it's like split brain studies debunk on the mind. It's very controversial. It seems like in neuroscience, you can just kind of use whatever you want to try to support your conclusions. And I have a little bit on the Leibniz experiments, and Leibniz saw no contradiction between his experiments and free will, and part to the ability to veto. But what best modifies the data? So we're coming to the end here. What best explains the reality? We must ask, does the reality look like it came from a mind foundation or a non-mental foundation? A mental foundation would explain fine-tuning, contingent facts, moral knowledge, reason, and intuitive belief in theism, mental states, and pose no arbitrary limits. Whereas the hard atheistic hypothesis with some sort of material foundation is going to not have this happen. Theism can unify all these data points by pointing to a necessary mind, whereas the atheist is probably going to have to appeal to independent brute facts. I think we got to prefer an explanation that can make unrelated phenomena related. That's why we have quantum gravity, we have classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, and they seem to be contradictory. We don't know what's going on. So we say, hey, we got this quantum gravity idea, which would kind of unify these two theories and make physics more coherent as a whole. John will probably have to show why my reasons fail or why it's more probable to think the foundation is not a mind. And lastly, theism is not an alternative, but it's a rival hypothesis. To say theism is likely to be true, you need to provide another theory. And I understand that John isn't saying that God does not exist, so I'm not asking him to prove that. That'd be silly, and I don't think theists should do that. My main point, great quote from Trent Dower to close this off. The standard model of physics posits 16 fundamental particles that fit into 3 categories. Some theists think that the simplicity of a theistic universe should be assessed similarly. Theism postulates one brute fact, which you could say is a perfect mind, and the follows that in conjunction with necessary truths about value. Bare theism's fact is the existence of a person with 2 properties, knowledge and power, held in the simplest possible way, zero limitation. Naturalism lacks this kind of explanatory simplicity systematically. There will be quite a number of brute facts, the existence of contingent beings, the existence of the number of laws, and the many particular parameters of those laws, and so on. Count up the number of brute facts in naturalism by the same method used earlier will be difficult, but it seems that inevitably it postulates more than one brute fact, existence with only 2 properties held in the simplest ways. So my conclusion here is that theism has more explanatory power and less fundamental commitments. So thank you.
Okay, that if I was him, I would say that you would probably be the most challenging Christian opponent I have had in a debate. That was an amazing opening statement. Can you repeat just that last part that you said so I could remember for myself?
Yeah, so my conclusion is theism has more explanatory power with less fundamental commitments.
Okay, theism has more explanatory power with less fundamental commitments. Okay. All right, Godless, you ready?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure Zach actually breathed in that presentation, but I'm glad.
My dad texted me. He was like, "Slow down."
He just took one long breath right before he did that opening statement. Just blew right through it. Incredible.
All right. Well, if I do have a presentation myself, but I'm just going to put it on my own cam. So I don't know. Would it be okay to just give me the full screen? Awesome. All right. Let's get down into the nitty gritty of this and ask the question of, does God exist? Get my notes pulled up here real quick. So first, I want to thank everyone for being here today to take part in this debate. And I'm going to be presenting my argument for why God is insufficient as the best explanation for our reality. So my arguments rely on the prior probability of any one religion being the correct version of theism, the insufficient nature of theism's explanations for events in reality, and the bad arguments used to argue for the existence of God. So first, I want to lay out the prior probability that any one definition of God or theistic belief is the correct one. Currently, there are 4,200 religions in existence today, with many more that have existed in the past. All these past religions have been proven to be false. We know that Zeus doesn't throw lightning bolts. We know a rainbow-colored snake hasn't vomited out Australian Aboriginals. We know that Uranus didn't impregnate Gaia and give birth to Titans. These are beliefs of past religions. At the time, they were considered to be representations of reality. This is the fate of all religious ideas. Even in Christianity, we have obsolete ideas. The creation of the earth in Genesis is not representative of reality. The earth and the diversity of life that we find on earth today was not created 6,000 years ago. Even ideas like God mandating the taking of slaves has changed since its conception. There are numerous ways that we know specific definitions of God, like the Abrahamic God, isn't reality. We know the earth is 4.54 billion years old. We know the universe is at least 13.5 billion years old. We know that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. The prior probability of an idea that doesn't match what we experience in reality being true is essentially 0%. Every idea that is true should match what we find in reality. The likelihood of any one of these religious ideas being the correct religious idea, is vanishingly small. However, they can all be wrong. Next, theism has insufficient explanations for events that happen in reality. Ultimately, the only explanation that theism can provide is God. The God answer doesn't tell us anything meaningful about events that occur in reality. Attributing some event to God only succeeds at stopping people from critically thinking about why or how some event happened. The more specific definitions of God do not provide more information. They only exacerbate the issue. How do you know that a particular event was caused by that particular definition of God? Another problem is that these specific definitions of God can't all be correct, but they can all be wrong. Put plain and simple, there is no connection between this reality and anything supernatural. In order for you to attribute some event to God, you must first prove that this God can even affect our reality. God is not really an explanation for anything. Every supernatural event that has supposedly happened in the past has always been proven to be a natural event later. Take lightning, for example. The ancient Greeks thought that Zeus wielded lightning as a weapon. Every place struck by lightning was considered sacred. Muslims have also attributed lightning to their God. Jeremiah 51:16 claims that God controls lightning. All of these supernatural ideas can be and are false. We know that lightning is caused by large collections of positively and negatively charged particles interacting with each other. This normally occurs in clouds, but also can happen between the clouds and the ground. This process is dictated by the physics of the natural world. We have no need for a supernatural explanation when we have a natural one. Again, the only explanation theistic ideas can give us is God. And now to get to the arguments for God's existence. And This was prepared separate from obviously the opening statement that was read here tonight. We'll get into that a little bit more. These are some of the most common arguments for God that I've run into. They are by no means a complete list of arguments, and I'm really, really excited to get into the discussion over the many arguments that Zach has provided tonight. So there have been several arguments for the existence of God. The cosmological argument suggests that there is a transcendent first cause of this universe, and that cause is God. This argument makes a leap in logic from what caused the inflation of the universe to God. The bigger leap in logic occurs when it is used to suggest a specific definition of God. I agree that something caused the inflation of the universe, but you don't have the evidence to say that cause was God. You must first prove that natural events need supernatural intervention in order to happen. Next, the teleological argument is an argument from design. It postulates that if something looks designed, then it must be designed. Everything that was designed has a creator. Therefore, the universe has a creator since it looks designed. Just because you think the universe looks designed doesn't mean that it is designed. What would be the criteria for determining designed and undesigned objects? We have natural explanations for how natural objects come into existence without the need of a supernatural intervention. And if we have a natural explanation, then we don't need a supernatural one. The moral argument is likewise insufficient. The moral argument speculates that God is needed for morality to be absolute or objective. If there is no absolute or objective morality, then everything is just an opinion. Since murder is absolutely wrong, then God must be the source of this knowledge. Only an absolute transcendent being can provide this basis. But this doesn't make sense with what we experience in reality. If God has done this, then we should expect his moral code to remain absolute across time. Even now, our moral foundations change depending on what society we live in. We would also need to more specifically define this deity in order to argue for their supposed moral foundation. As an example, let's take a look at Christianity. We don't see an immutable moral foundation in Christianity. In fact, Christianity's moral foundation changes depending on time and place. In Numbers 31:17-18, God commands his chosen people to abduct young girls after murdering their entire family, including all the young boys and babies. If you transpose that into the present day, these would be horrible and abhorrent war crimes. But it's okay for them to do that because God told them to do it. If this isn't considered good or okay to do now, why did that deity command it? Considering most, if not all, religions of the past, why would their respective deities require them to do any of the things that humanity has done? If this moral code is not immutable, then what explains our changing moral foundation? Since our common moral foundation seems to change with the social norms of society, it seems like we are the ones that dictate what our moral foundation is. If we are the ones dictating what we see as morally right, wrong, and neutral, then we would expect a changing landscape of morality. That's exactly what we find in religious communities. We see religious people with differing opinions on what their absolute moral code is. Morality is an emergent property of a complex central nervous system. That's why we find primitive moral foundations in other forms of life in the animal kingdom. It's why our notion of right and wrong varies depending on the time and place that we exist. This provides an actual explanation for why morality exists as we experience it. Could there be some absolute moral foundation that exists? Sure, there could be. Due to the human condition and how we experience our reality, we would never know if we attained such an immutable set of moral laws. So to summarize my case, basically, I don't think a belief in a deity is warranted due to the lack of insufficient evidence to support such a belief. The prior probability of any religious faith being correct is vanishingly small. The explanations that theism provides are insufficient because they do not explain anything about our reality. Finally, all of the arguments for the existence of God fall short of showing that a God most likely exists. There are plenty of more arguments for the existence of God, which we will probably get into in the discussion period. All right. Well, that'll be it for my opening statement, which I think I'm coming in a few minutes under, so that's always good.
Yep, good job. That was also a really good opening statement. Made a lot of really good points that I was hoping I'd see addressed.
Anyways, I'm here to answer questions. So what questions do you got for me there, Zach?
Let's do it. So this is 10 minutes of me asking questions for John, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it. All right. So I figured we could just kind of go through your presentation and then you'll probably go through mine. So your first point was like the prior probability of theism. You talked about like the many different gods kind of like ruling against evidence for like theism. I would agree with you in terms of like specific religions that it would like reduce the prior probability. But why do you think against like the general theism, a necessary mind that created the universe, why do you think different religions counts against the prior probability of just theism, a mind creating the universe being true?
Well, because anytime we've ever tried to describe what this mind might be or describe this mind in any other way other than, hey, there's a floating mind out there in the universe that, I guess created the universe or something like that. Like anytime you go any more specific than that, then I mean, it just falls apart. Like no other human description of this supposed mind out there has ever actually been representative of reality. Now, with you being a Christian, I know that you would disagree with that, but from my point of view, every other description of God, other than the ambiguous kind of deity that just exists out there beyond our beyond our reach or comprehension, that doesn't actually, affect things in reality, I would be agnostic on that God. I don't know whether or not that God exists, but I would say that the probability of us being able to ever describe that God or ever actually know that he exists is vanishingly small to the point of negligible.
Okay, so in quantum theory, there's about like 10 different interpretations of how does the observer and like the collapse of the wave function and things like that play out. And we don't really know like what the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics is, but no one doubts that quantum mechanics is a real thing because there's all of these different interpretations. So my question for you is, why should we doubt that like theism is why would this cast out for theism if there's just these different interpretations of how this who this mind that created the universe is?
Well, because of the fact that, everything that we've observed in reality is because of natural explanation, natural processes that explain things. So, I mean, the fact that, and this kind of goes into the prior probability again, the fact that everything ends up resolving to a natural process that has no need for some kind of supernatural either mind or creator or anything like that in order to make those things happen, then I don't see any reason to believe in it. But like for quantum mechanics, while it is an emerging field and we do have a lot of hypotheses surrounding it, we do know some very basic things about quantum theory that we have evidence for. So, I mean, I would say that quantum theory has much more evidence than any definition of God or any idea of God, including the general idea of God.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. And I would obviously disagree because I think there's lots of evidence for God, but we can save that for later. The supernatural natural distinction was really interesting to me because as I was listening to some of your videos, I was really curious about this. I'm really looking forward to asking you this. But because I think by your definition, I might be a naturalist. So how do you define the supernatural versus natural? What's that distinction to you?
Well, I mean, the supernatural would be something that I guess exists outside of nature, but can, affect things within nature. And so what we would need as far as proving whether or not a mind or a god or deity, whatever you want to call it, exists outside of reality in general, you would have to find some kind of connection between the natural world and this supernatural realm that everybody that believes in a God, thinks exists. But the problem is, though, at least from my point of view, is that we don't have any evidence to suggest that these supernatural events ever happen, or that anything from outside of reality can affect us within reality. So it kind of seems like, to me at least, there's no point in believing in this connection if there's no evidence to suggest a connection.
Okay. Can I interject really quickly and ask a question? Are both of you arguing based off of the premise that if there's a God, it's a supernatural being, or is there room for the potential of there being a God that exists but as part of the natural world?
I think it just depends on how you define the supernatural natural distinction. Because if you say that like what's natural is everything that exists in reality, I'd be a naturalist. But if you're gonna say like disembodied minds or
I'm sorry, Godless, is that what you were saying?
Well, I mean, typically, every definition of this ambiguous God, just a basic theistic God, is that it created the natural world, and so I don't see how like it could create the natural world but also exist inside the natural world.
Right.
I think
I was actually referring to how he was. It seemed like he understood you to be defining naturalism as everything that exists in reality, but it seems like if that's not really what you're saying. You're saying naturalism is more what we know of, like natural elements, principles, relations. But okay, I just wanted to make sure because that you weren't defining supernatural as being not real.
Yeah. So if I can, I guess what I would say is natural is anything that exists within our universe or a universe in general.
Okay.
Am I going to keep going?
Okay. Yep. Keep going.
Okay. So like when I think, I'll just leave like my thoughts on the supernatural, natural, and we can move on here. But like I think about like the natural, supernatural is like just imagining like this big blob of everything. Like if you read How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen, the best introductory book into like the theistic belief, we can explain everything about that big blob of everything that exists, like you, me, tables, chairs, all this stuff within that blob of reality that is everything that exists. I would say that the mind is foundational, and by that, if that's your definition, then I'd say I'm a naturalist because I think the foundation of this everything is a mind. But you can press me on that if you want when it's your turn. So we talked about the insufficient explanation thing. Because the supernatural natural distinction, I think most of the time it's just kind of garbage. Sorry. Because I don't really understand what it means. But we can just move on from that. The insufficient explanations here. So what do you think about my arguments, Jod? Are all my arguments saying I don't know, therefore like God did it? I don't think that's what you said, but it sounded like something similar to that. Like, is that like what you got from my arguments?
Well, just to be completely fair here, I guess in either my cross-examination or the open discussion, we'll probably have to really drill a bit more into it because I'm from the South. I don't speak like, high-speed train speeds. Because everything that I got from you was like God is a necessary fact. There was some arguments from design in there. There's morality. Something about a perfect being sharing love, and we would expect that. Reason exists, therefore God exists. And just a lot of general, it seemed to me, and this is in no way meant to be like an insult to you.
Hey, you're good.
It seems to me like a lot of your arguments were just sort of basic arguments that you sort of dressed up with complicated language, and so I just kind of wrote down as I could. But as soon as I got done writing down one thing, you had already moved on to the next argument, so it was kind of hard for me to keep up. Another thing I got is God is obvious, so he exists, which is I know these are really diluted, but like I said, I was trying to write really fast. So in my opinion, all the arguments that you presented were well thought out arguments, but they just seemed really dressed up to me, really dressed up basic arguments that everybody uses for God's existence.
Okay. Well, I'd encourage like anyone listening. I don't think you, and it's fine. I talked really fast, but I don't think you really represented my arguments well, which I'm not blaming you because I talked really fast. But I encourage you guys to go back and pause. You can see the slides and see what my arguments are. But we can just move on from that for now. Let's talk about, Okay, the first like kind of claim I make is there's some sort of like necessary fact. You could call it like the first cause that grounds reality, and I'm fine with it being like for that part of the argument, like a quantum state or energy matter or something like that. Do you think you tend to agree that there's some sort of necessary fact? And if not, what's kind of like your idea?
Well, I mean, I think that it can you explain to me what you mean by necessary fact? Because I've never really understood the theist argument over necessary fact.
I was just going to ask you both to define that term. So great
Okay.
call on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, John. So for further reading, How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen, I'll keep plugging that book the entire time. But necessary fact is something that couldn't have been otherwise. It's the first cause. It's the necessary thing. It's the end of the causal explanation. So it's something that has necessary existence. It's not influenced by anything outside of itself for its existence. So maybe that helps.
Okay. Well, so I have a tough time differentiating between a deity figure and just the very fabric of reality in that respect.
Yeah.
So I mean, you would call it a mind or a deity or whatever, and I would just call it the fabric of reality. And so, but I still don't see a way to differentiate between those two.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think that's a good place where we can build a bridge and say, well, yeah, there's something necessary, and you obviously don't think it's a mind, and that's for that part of the argument. That's fine. And that's why I had all the rest of the stuff I said was like why I think it's a mind versus something that's like quantum or material or something like that. My last question for you is, you talked about the moral argument and moral disagreement a lot. We also have this thing called scientific disagreement. And there's a lot of different scientists that believe a lot of different things. And there's all kinds of disagreement. And like the scientific beliefs have shifted over time. A long time ago, a lot of people thought the earth was 6,000 years old. No, not many people do that anymore. So there's all this scientific disagreement. And we're changing our beliefs and things like that. So does that mean then, because we can't trust our moral, there's no like moral realism or anything like that because there's all these different beliefs? Should we say there's no scientific realism because there's all these different scientific beliefs?
Well, no. So science attempts to describe the reality that we're presented with the evidence and the information that we have on hand. If we gather more information, then that perspective changes, that view changes. So science by nature changes as we gain more information. So with more, the same thing can be said about our moral knowledge. Moral knowledge changes as society changes. So I see both of them existing on the same thing. Do I think that there's absolute scientific facts? There probably are. Whether or not we'll actually be able to know that we've attained these very absolute scientific facts, I don't think that we'll ever be able to know that. But in the same way, I don't think that we'll ever be able to know we've attained absolute moral knowledge.
All right. And it looks like our time's up. So we'll be transitioning to the next cross-examination.
All right, so here we go. Now it's my turn.
Grill me, John.
Yeah. So how I know in the opening argument, which maybe you can clarify because obviously I missed a lot. But I know at one point you talked about basically the teleological argument, the argument from design, how this universe seems designed. I remember you talking about like the fine-tuning of the universe. I'm kind of curious, how do you determine between designed things and undesigned things?
Yeah, this is a really good question because I saw in your opening. So my argument from design basically says that design allowing for embodied moral agents is more expected under theism than indifference. So like some sort of like materialistic naturalistic hypothesis. So from there, I said, well, under the materialistic like naturalistic hypothesis, there are a couple of reasons why I think it'd be less likely. One was just like the intuitiveness of it, like given like the hypothesis of indifference at the foundation, there's just many different ways the universe could have gone with it and don't involve like life and things. And I gave like some of the scientific constants which seem to support fine tuning, like the initial entropy of the universe and like the gravitational constant and things like that. So yeah.
Okay. But my problem comes in, I think, with point 2, in that the idea that a mind is more likely to be the source of this, or that the fine tuning and the design of this universe is more likely on a mind existing than not existing. What I see when I look at this is a 50-50 shot of whether or not this universe would develop the way that it did, or not exactly 50-50, but you get what I'm saying. Like, this universe could exist or it could not exist. It does exist, but we don't know if other universes with other constants exist. Why do you think that a mind creating this universe rules out the possibility of all of these other universes existing, or universes prior to our universe existing? How does a mind explain better, like, our universe existing when we don't have all of the information?
Sure. Well, obviously, like, all arguments and data are subject to change, like, pending further discovery. But like with like the like multiple universe hypothesis, I think there's a couple things. Well, like, one, it's like, well, first, there's no evidence of this. Well, and that's fine. Well, maybe things can change. And that's fine. I'm fine with that. Our universe is still like 100% life permitting overall, but then I think it also just kicks the problem up another level, where we'd say, like, okay, well, why is there governing laws or whatnot that would allow for this multiverse instead of just like one universe? So it seems like to me almost like if we're going to pose like, I don't think you're posing an infinite regress, but just like some sort of like multiverse, we're going to like, it's going to kick the problem of design up a level. And like my argument's just saying that like design aligned for more embodied moral agents is more likely under theism than like atheistic naturalism or something.
Well, would you agree that like the water cycle is a completely natural thing that doesn't require any supernatural intervention?
Well, I mean, if you define, it depends on what you define as supernatural. But I mean, in terms of like, there's explanations. Yeah, there's explanations for the water cycle that don't involve like a mind causing it to happen.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I guess my question is that if there are several processes in the natural world that doesn't require a mind in order for it to happen, then why should we think that any natural process requires a mind for it to occur?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think it'd be helpful, like at the beginning of the argument or my presentation, I talked about like there being a necessary fact, and like via the law of the non-excluded middle, it's either a mind or not a mind. And then I think like there's all these good reasons, like fine-tuning limits, reason, moral knowledge, etc., where it's a mind. And it seems like, for example, like it's interesting because like we have minds to some capacity. You could say it's emergent property of the brain. So I don't really see the issue with saying that there's like a mind that's fundamental. I hopefully didn't dodge your question, but I kind of forgot your question. So maybe feel free to push back or clarify, because I kind of had 18 different thoughts happen as you were talking. So yeah.
I could tell. Well, I mean, basically, I was kind of curious what exactly connects a mind to the natural world, and it kind of feels a bit like a presuppositional argument. Like, I presuppose that a God exists, therefore that is why the water cycle happens.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm, for one thing, not a presuppositional set. You mean I don't like that at all. But like, why I think that like they're like, why am I positing this mind when like material explanation can do all the work? That's a good question. One of the things I kind of wonder, I think it was Berkeley, he's a philosopher from I think like the 18th century, and he talked about this idea of like, how do we know there's a mind independent reality at all? You see, we have this material world and there's causes and effects, at least we think there are, but then he's like, okay, well, couldn't I just be wrong about the material world or something like that? And it's like, well, yes, I could be in the matrix. Could I be wrong about my own existence? No, I think therefore I am. It seems like a pretty fundamental thing. So I'd honestly argue that like mind is prior to matter in terms of like levels of reality, because it seems like from our own experience, our own minds come before our knowledge of the material world. I couldn't be wrong about my own existence, but I could be wrong in that this computer in front of me actually doesn't exist in terms of like a material sense. So my question would kind of be like, well, how do we know that there's a material world existing independently of any minds? So yeah.
Okay. Let's move to, since we're talking about minds, let's move to your reason exists, therefore God. Would that be a pretty basic representation of that argument?
I don't think so. I mean, I can read out the whole argument if you want.
I don't know. Well, I mean, we do have 5 minutes, but you can read it in probably about 10.
It's pretty short. So I'm just pointing up here. So it says the necessary fact is either a mind or not a mind. Law of non-excluded middle. If the foundation is not a mind, it's unlikely that reason would emerge. Reason exists, therefore the necessary fact is probably a mind. So another like Bayesian argument that reason is more likely under theism than naturalism.
But the problem is that I have with that argument is that our minds use natural processes in order to operate. There's nothing inside of our mind that exists supernaturally or anything like that. So the fact that our brains are these biochemical machines, it seems to me like just like the water cycle, our brains don't need any kind of special explanation in order to explain why they work, or how they arose naturally. We know exactly how brains developed over the course of time, and it all happened very naturally. So I guess I just wondering what to you seems to require, like in our brain chemistry or how our brain works, what to you requires this mind independent of our natural world.
Yeah. Well, I would say with like the mind independent of the natural world, I'd say we'd also have to justify how there could be a material world independent of minds if we're just going to kind of go that route. But we can go into that further if you want. I would say, well, like I have no problem with reason being emergent to some degree. Like it obviously seems like if we take like an evolutionary theory, it would be beneficial to kind of like make right choices and judgments and things like that, and to like eat the non-poisonous fruit or something like that. Like that's fine. I'd agree with that. But what I think the problem is when we get into like making decisions and like in terms of like complex things. So like my argument was like, if like a hard atheism is true, your decision to not believe in God wasn't based on your own power to rationally decide it, but it was based on the more fundamental laws governing the universe. Because we'd probably live in like a deterministic universe. So that's my argument. From like reason is like, well, my choices in like believing in God isn't based on outside influences determining it. It's based on my own capacity. But like under like an atheistic naturalism, I don't think you can have that, because we're going to live in a deterministic universe where the laws of nature are more fundamental, and that's the reason you don't believe in God. So hopefully that helps.
Well, I mean, what's your evidence that we don't live in a deterministic universe? Like we don't live in a universe that that isn't controlled by a mind, that everything's just operating naturally. And, it's been said, I can't remember who said it, but it's been said that if we could know the positions and velocity of every single atom in the universe, then we could predict what will happen in the future.
I think that's Daniel Dennett. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, that's fine. But in any case, I think that, applying that massive amount of knowledge that, we could potentially tell the future. So I'm just kind of curious what to you seems to indicate that our brains don't operate biomechanically without this mind independent thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few things. Like one, like free will just seems intuitively to be true. That doesn't mean it's true, but it just seems intuitively obvious. Like in the same way, like there's other minds or there's external world. It seems intuitively obvious to me that I have free will. And then there's arguments like we could talk like the moral consequences of like determinism, where it seems like there's these really bad consequences that seem very unlikely to be true. If we get with regards to like if there isn't free will, and yeah, that's a couple things. And I kind of lost my train of thought when I saw the timer. My brain's kind of scattered right now. I think my opening statement like depleted my lungs or something.
So we hit our time on that. I want to say really quickly before we transition to the next period, my understanding, and we can continue this in the open discussion, is that what Zach's saying is that you need some justification for there being matter existing independent of minds. And what you're saying, what Godless Engineer is saying, is that our minds are composed of atoms that are in the material world. And that seems to say, like, what is, turns the question to what is the justification for there being some supernatural, or saying that the mind had to exist prior to the material world. Does that seem fair to both of you, what I just said?
I'll go first. Kind of. I was just like that kind of like response was just to well, John's like, well, don't we just know that there's this material world that doesn't need any minds? Well, I was like, okay, well, couldn't we just say that there's just this mental world and we don't need anything to explain material? We can explain everything mentally. So that was just in response to like an argument from John. I wouldn't kind of like stamp my foot down on that position. So yeah.
Okay, but Godless, did my understanding seem to fit your point?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. Sorry to push it, everyone. I just wanted to clarify on that. All right.
Okay. So I think, if you don't mind, I think it'd be interesting to talk about like my last point I made, which is the idea that like theism isn't an alternative. Like it's not like, oh well, none of these other hypotheses work, so let's just throw God in there. That solves everything. I think of it as like a rival hypothesis where I say that, well, I'm saying there's a mind, and it's the best of the different hypotheses we have. So I almost think of this as like we're comparing hypotheses. So I'm curious, kind of like, what's your take on that, John?
Well, I think that you're just sort of, calling it a mind. I realize that things looking designed or the whole idea of morality, like you would want to give, creatures that you create a moral foundation or something like that. But I really don't see those as like absolute things that you would want to like design as a mind. What evidence do you have that these things are what the mind would want to do?
Yeah,
You
that's
may
a
have
great.
covered that in your opening. I'm sorry if you did.
No, that's great. So one thing I said, like, if you press me further in terms of like what do I believe like specifically regarding God, I'd say like it's a perfect being, like a perfect agent, like perfect moral knowledge, perfect power, things like that. I would say like a perfect being might want to like share his love, allow others like experience the world, things like that. So yeah, and then I think again, like we kind of missed like my main point, which is like, so let's say that, like if we can agree that there's a necessary fact, which I think we can, and like your idea is something non-mental, which is fine for the first part. I'm saying it's mental, and here's my reasons to support that it's a mental foundation rather than one of these other ideas. So I'm just saying that this is the best explanation of the data is a mental foundation, whereas one of these other alternatives. So yeah.
Well, I think that if a mind like is in charge of all of this, he's rather incompetent. I mean, just look around at the universe. He's rather, especially if he made this universe to like to provide to have life like come into being. He did a really, really bad job designing it. So I guess my issue to get to a more definite question here is how do you define like his nature or this mind's not his nature, but this mind's nature? Because, you said that, you would think that he would want to share his love or something like that. Mm-hmm. What would be love to this mind out there? Like, what would that even look like to this mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think we're kind of falling a little bit outside of the debate topic here, kind of get into more like different like models of God and such. So there's like classical theism, neoclassical theism, panentheism, like all these different models of God.
Just one second. Are you guys arguing? Are you arguing, Zach, for a perfect being or just for a God? Like, are you? I mean,
yeah.
I used to. Is your argument dependent on perfection? And I'm sorry, we both started talking at the same time.
No, you're good. I did kind of switch a little bit there. I argue just for simplicity's sake, a necessary mind that created the universe. But I do think if we go deeper, I think we'd say that, well, this mind is probably perfect because that's the simplest form of like being and such, at least in terms of like looking at like mind models and such, like models of God. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Godless, it seems like then your response is you're pressing him on why is there so much imperfection in the design designed by a perfect designer. That's where you're at right now.
Right.
Okay. So
are you making like, are you making like an evidential argument from like evil or hiddenness or something? Or are you making like a logical argument? Like, I don't really get like what your argument here is, John, or like you responding to one of my arguments.
Well, like my argument is like you said that this perfect being would want to share its love with creatures that it created or whatnot. And my mind just goes off and thinks, well, for this transcendent mind that apparently exists, what would love even be? What would love look like? And if there is this transcendent mind that it is this perfect designer that designed this universe to have life come about, why did he make it so scarce and so hard for life to come about? Yeah. Because most of this universe is uninhabitable, at least to us.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So you're making like kind of like the lifeless objection almost to like the fine-tuning argument. Well, like, isn't the universe just lifeless? So there's a couple of things I could say in response. One is if you go back to my opening statement, I have like a little brief like blurb there with like my like a basic response. Well, it's like, yes, the fact that there is the the fact that there is these agents on the earth is the first place. There's many other possible configurations of the universe that would have no moral agents of any kind existing on any planet. Like we could just have like just atoms or just like quantum phenomena or something like that. No like complex life forms or anything that can like say they can make moral decisions or stuff, given like the hypothesis of indifference. And there's a really good quote from Richard Swinburne I can read. Wait, no, that doesn't relate to that objection. Sorry, my bad. But yeah, that's kind of like my basic response is that, yeah, most of the universe is lifeless, but there is life. Like it's 99% like uninhabitable, but it's 100% life permitting. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's life permitting under the right circumstances, and under a more naturalistic point of view, we wouldn't be the only life in the universe. Life definitely has arisen elsewhere in the universe, probably not near us. But the fact that God, this mind, made it so scarce, I would say is kind of telling as far as whether or not a mind would do it. Also, why would a mind use such an imperfect engine like evolution in order to create the diversity of life that we have here on Earth?
Yeah, there's so many good questions you brought up, John. So I appreciate that a lot. So with like the I'm just trying to get everything you said in my head here. So with like, first off, with the idea of like, well, the universe, it seems like there's just like not a lot of life. So it doesn't like, it almost doesn't seem like fine tuned. But like with my response to that, with like the design argument is that, well, there's many possible configurations of the universe where there's just no life at all, where we just have like complex molecules can't form if the constants are differently, or like things like that. There's just no planets form, things like that. So it seems like in that sense, there would be this evidence for theism because it wouldn't predict that something like that would be the case. Whereas on the hypothesis of like an indifferent foundation, we'd have to grant that would be like something that's the case. And then with like the evolutionary evils, that's a really good question. We could do a whole debate on like the problem of evil and evolutionary evil. I would encourage everyone, if you're curious, there's a really good paper. If you like Google Josh Rasmussen evolutionary evil PDF, there's a really good paper on like why would God use a process like evolution. So I do want to say like that would be like a problem of evil argument. So John's gonna have to frame like an evidential. He's either gonna have to frame it as like a logical argument where like evolution and theism are incompatible, or an evidential argument where you'd say it's like more likely under atheism than theism, and like hard atheism under theism, in terms of like there being no God because of evolution. So I'd just be curious, like what argument would you say with evolutionary evils? Is it like a logical incompatibility, or is it like the evolutionary evils outweigh the power of like maybe arguments for theism?
You kind of cut out there. Could you state that again so everyone could hear you?
Yeah, sure. So the last point I made with like evolutionary evils is like we can get into specific theodicies and stuff. Like there's a lot of interesting theodicies you could talk about, like a knowable natural order.
No, it's just your question
like
that cut out.
Oh, yeah. My apologies. I'm curious, like, is John with evolutionary evil, is this an evidential argument or is this a logical argument, or am I just totally missing the ballpark here? Because that kind of helps me with like gauging the argument.
Well, to say evolutionary evil, I think is putting a lot on what I said. Okay. I said that evolution was an imperfect engine, and I don't think that necessarily makes it evil. It just makes it natural. And so the part that I find is incompatible with this perfect mind or some kind of transcendent. I can never say that word. Transcendent.
Yeah,
no,
it's a weird word.
There you go. What is incompatible with it is the fact that evolution is imperfect. The fact that, because of evolution, we have things like genetic diseases that happen in all, forms of life here on Earth. And there's so many ways for evolution to go wrong. And there's very few ways for evolution to go right. It just kind of seems like that his mind has made it unnecessarily insufficient, like the process of evolution, or any process, any natural process that we really know of that happens naturally, which are all processes. It just kind of seems like if a perfect mind is behind it, or a mind at all, they did a really poor job of designing it.
Sure. So once again, like, I think it'd just be helpful, like, to kind of know, like, if you're making an evidential or logical argument, because I think that matters a lot in this, like, dialectic. But like, why would God allow evolution? Like, why would he use evolution to create when he has all these other, like, alternatives? I'll just totally grant the theory of evolution. Like, I just I mean, I don't know, like in terms, I haven't studied the science, but I'm not like personally like set against evolution or anything.
Well, okay, can I give you something more definite?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay, so like the process of the copying of a DNA molecule, right? That's an imperfect process that usually ends up with copy errors or other ways that mutations can be inserted, and that's one of the driving forces of evolution are these copy errors. But I guess my question is that why wouldn't a perfect being make it so that these copy errors just simply didn't happen?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate your question. So there's a few different responses, and like this Rasmussen paper is great on this, but here's a couple of my responses. One is this idea of just like having a knowable natural order. Like I think there's value in having a natural order where we can go back and discover, like it's the whole project of science, is we can go back and try to understand like how the world worked, and having this knowable natural order allows for predictions. So like a thing like evolution would allow for us to be able to uncover our origins in like a beautiful way. I think like there's a good quote from Michael Murray, which I can read if you want. So I won't read it because it's long, but if you want to press me further on this, I'll probably read it. So there's that. And then I think there's things like maybe like the relationship between like God, between us and like other creatures. Like if we look at like having like almost like a tree of life where like in some sense we are related to like every creature and being in the world, like dogs and cats and all that stuff. I think that adds value in terms of like, loving these animals and like seeing these things as valuable because like we're in a sense we're related to them. And there's all kinds of things we could talk about here. That's a couple of my responses to like
so coming from a software engineer point of view, if I were to write what we would call the program of DNA and evolution in general, I would think that we would I would definitely, as a designer myself, put in blocks for bad mutations or bad copy errors, right? I would definitely only allow mutations that would benefit the species at any time that it happened. Okay. But the problem is that it seems like this mind has not done that. And this kind of seems like a very definite place where it shows that this whole mind idea is kind of lacking in the explanatory department. Because if this perfect mind or this grand mind that did everything, caused everything to come into existence, set all the properties and everything like that, it would seem to me like he would just do some of the most basic I guess programming or creation stuff that you would want to do. I mean, it's almost like Bethesda released a universe and that's the one that we got.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. So there's a few different responses again. So like I'll read, there's a couple questions here that I'll give you. And then I'd love to get to other arguments too, because we only have like 15 minutes left, I think. But so I'll give you the last word. Here's a couple responses and questions. And
could I just say one thing before you go forward? Just please hold the point that you're on, because I don't want to make you forget what you were saying.
You're good.
But am I correct in saying, so Zach, it seems like at this point in the debate, what you're arguing is that a perfect, intelligent designer is the best explanation based on the evidence that we have. And then Godless Engineer, you're arguing that that is not the best inference.
Well, I would say that his position lacks explanatory power for, some of the things that he is just sort of what comes across as me is basically just assuming.
Okay, so I would categorize that as it's simply just being he's arguing for it being the best inference, and you're in disagreement that it is the best. All right, good. Just wanted to clarify on that. All right, please go where you were just about to go, Zach.
Yeah, sure. So I'm arguing that there's a necessary fact, and the best explanation of the data is this fact is a mind rather than something like maybe like a quantum vacuum state or something like that. So my two questions for John is like, I think there's value in a natural order, and I think that's like part of the explanation for evolution if we grant the theory. And the questions would become, one, is there a possible world that would contain the goodness of the sorts and amounts found in the actual world, and which contains substantially less natural evil than the actual world? So Michael Murray says this task is hopeless. So my question for you is, I don't know like how plausible it is for there to be like another natural order that contains these great goods that I'd say we can find in this world, but has like a different like kind of like result or different process for like creation. So that's a little complicated here, but I'll give you the last word on evolutionary evils and stuff, because I'd love to talk to you about these other arguments.
Well, I would first, want you to define what you mean by good, or what you
Mhm.
would mean by evil, because those words are very subjective and they change throughout history. What seems good to us now isn't necessarily good, way back when. The social landscape has changed drastically over, thousands and thousands of years. Ever since we as a social species emerged out of Africa, our moral foundations, what we know of as good, bad, right, wrong, evil, those things have changed. So it kind of depends on what you mean as far as like, genetic diseases and everything like that.
Mhm.
I would think that a mind that would create the universe would also be able to do fundamentally basic design things in the natural world. And we just don't see those very basic design concepts emerging in the natural world where they should be if a mind is responsible.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. And I can send you this paper if you want by Josh Rasmussen. If you want, John, I think it's very profitable with like evolutionary evils. But we obviously can't get into that more for now. I'd love to talk to you about the argument from limits, because we haven't addressed this at all on like the cross exams or anything. So do you need me to kind of like go over this argument very briefly again, or do you kind of like are you familiar with what I said?
If you want to go over it again, please do.
Yeah, I was going to say that would probably be best for the audience to go over
Okay.
quickly.
Sure. So premise one is the necessary fact does not depend on anything further for any further explanation for its existence. Premise two then is arbitrary limits probably have a further explanation. And by defining arbitrary limits, I mean like things that are quantities of things that could have been different. So like numbers of like atoms, particles, energy, other material objects, like the necessary fact, like why would it have 500 particles versus like 501 or 499? So since arbitrary limits probably have a further explanation, the necessary fact does not have a further explanation, the necessary fact is probably something without arbitrary limits. So like a mind hypothesis wouldn't have any of these arbitrary limits. So it seems like a simpler hypothesis, all things being equal. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the limits argument, John.
Well, I feel like you're assuming arbitrary limits.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, you're just assuming things are arbitrary. I would hazard to bet that these arbitrary limits that you think are arbitrary actually have natural explanations as to why they exist in that state.
Yeah, sure. So what we're talking about is the necessary fact. So the necessary fact doesn't depend on any explanation for its existence.
Okay, maybe I can be a bit more direct. Can we talk about maybe one particular arbitrary limit that you think is arbitrary?
Yeah, sure. So this is like where like the value of like hypothesis comparison comes in, because like if you're gonna say like maybe it's like the quantum scalar vacuum, because I've heard in a lot of like your call-in shows like people like be like Kalam, where you're like, okay, first cause to God, which is a really good question, and they'd be like, like other people will be like not really sure what to say. So a quantum scalar vacuum, like that's a hypothesis of, okay, maybe there's a quantum vacuum that's necessary. That's going to pose arbitrary limits, whereas a mind wouldn't. In a quantum vacuum, there's probably going to be a field for all these elementary particles. There's going to be things like electrons, quarks, photons, gluons.
What's the arbitrary limit in this particular example?
Things like the number of particles, the amount of energy in the vacuum, the laws that govern it, all these things like seemingly could have been different, but they're going to have to be like in a certain way. That's the way they are. How
do you know that there are, like, how do you know that those are the limits? Like, for instance, of the vacuum, what is it, the inflaton quantum scalar field, that's proposed for the inflation of the universe. How do you know that like the energy that it released when it fluctuated from the false vacuum state to a true vacuum state, how do you know that energy is capped out? Like, why do you think that energy is static?
So I'm not saying that it's capped out. I'm just saying, so let's say that there's like 38 units of energy in this quantum scalar vacuum, and they don't depend on a further explanation for their existence. They're necessary. Then I think the question becomes, well, why is there 38? Is it 39? Why isn't it 37? Why isn't it 36? And maybe you could be like Graham Oppy and say, well, that's just the way it is. It's necessary. But then I kind of wonder, well, okay, you're posing this like brute arbitrary limit, whereas like the mind hypothesis doesn't have this. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I feel like we're playing a what if game with something that nobody knows, like the amount of energy that was produced in the Big Bang. We've got hypotheses about how much it was or whatever, but we don't really know. So maybe maybe I can propose something that's a bit more concrete that we can really wrap our minds around. Like, would you consider it an arbitrary limit that like H2O has 3 atoms? Is that an arbitrary limit?
If it's contingent fact, no, because it depends on an outside explanation for its existence. If it's the necessary fact, then I would say yes.
Okay. So like you're saying that the composition of a water molecule is a contingent fact?
So I would say so, because it depends on an explanation for its existence. Like, how did this water molecule come into being? Well, somehow the hydrogen bonded to the oxygen. Like, for example, I have this water bottle in front of me, and there's like maybe like 200 milliliters of water. That's probably way too little. But like, can I finish? Do you mind if I finish, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's an arbitrary limit, 200 units, but there's an explanation for that. Well, I poured this much water into it, so that's why there's this amount of units of water in my water bottle. But I'm saying with the foundation, it seems like we couldn't have that arbitrary limits, because limits depend on further explanations for their existence. So whatever is necessary, whatever's at the foundation, it wouldn't be arbitrarily limited, because it's just like we're posing these limits that do have further explanations. So I just don't see why we have to pose these like brute limits. It decreases the prior probability.
Right. Well, so I feel like what this ultimately resolves down to is like whenever I'm in a discussion about the cosmological argument and somebody says, well, God had to be the one to create the universe. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, well, who created God? Oh, yeah. God doesn't need a creator. So what this ultimately resolves to is a special pleading argument, because you're specially pleading for this mind, right? And saying that, well, you know, this mind is in the universe, but it also is outside the universe, and it doesn't need any kind of explanation for why it's there. Now, the fabric of reality, I would say, I don't know, like when it came into existence or how it came into existence, or if it's eternal or not. But I would think that, you know, something naturally existing, there's nothing that restricts it from being eternally existing, while you are bringing up this mind figure. And if this mind also exists within our universe and outside of our universe, then it would also need this, you know, explanation for its existence. You can't just specially plead away that, oh, it's just always existed. It just seems like you're skirting around the necessary explanation for why it's even there.
Okay, well, a couple of things. One, I'm just following the premises of my argument. Like, if my first two premises of like the Proust contingency argument are true, or the first three, and then the conclusion follows, then that's just, it's true. But like, okay, are you familiar with Graham Oppy's work at all?
No.
Okay, well, he's a really smart atheist. You might benefit a lot from him. But he has this idea of like the initial state hypothesis. So he's going to say, okay, I'll grant that there's a necessary fact. He says, okay, this necessary fact is the initial state of the universe. Whatever that is, it's the initial state, and it's necessary. I wouldn't say that's special pleading, because I would agree there's some sort of necessary fact, and we can talk about like why I think my explanation of what the necessary fact is better. So I don't think atheistic explanations of the necessary fact are special pleading. So I don't really get like where the special pleading accusation is coming.
Well, because you're specially pleading for this mind that's independent of the universe, but also exists within the universe. I mean, what I'm saying is that the fabric of reality does have an explanation for its origin. I don't know it. We probably will never know it, but it eternally existing, there's nothing in nature, because it is a natural fact. Nothing in nature limits it to being eternal. But on your side, talking about this mind, you just kind of specially plead for it to be eternal without actually explaining like how it came into existence. Do you think that, because my assumption is that you're saying that this mind is definitely like eternal, didn't need to be created or anything like that, right?
Well, I mean, I would say the necessary fact is something that couldn't have been otherwise. It's something that doesn't depend on any further explanation for its existence. So that's like where the causal explanation ends, is in whatever this necessary fact is. And I do want to say, like, again, you kind of brought up this idea of like, well, you're just saying that there's this mind that exists independent of like any material like world or whatnot. I really feel like I could just say the same thing to you, John. I said, well, you're just saying that there's this material world that exists independently of the mind, and we have no experience of that. And even like mind seems fundamental. How do you know?
How do I know that you know the material world exists absent of all minds?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. The first inkling of life started like 4.54 billion years ago, like I said in my opening.
Mhm.
And as far as we know, no life existed up until that point. And we know that the inflation of the universe happened at least 13.5 billion years ago. So it seems to me like for about 9 billion years, as far as we know, there was no mind. Unless you're going to argue that everything was created 6,000 years ago when humans were created. I feel like we have ample evidence to show that this universe exists absent a mind.
Okay, but couldn't I just say that the necessary fact is a mind, and that's like, and you're just pausing. You're saying all these things about like the age of the Earth and such, which I'm fine with. I don't have any problem with the Earth being that old. But once again, that's not evidence that there's mind existing independent or matter existing independently of a mind. You're just saying scientific facts.
Well, you see, we don't have any evidence that suggests that this mind outside of our universe even exists. So you're just sort of arbitrarily creating this mind as the thing that exists. But I think that what you would need to do is you would need to separate this God from what we understand as the fabric of reality. Sorry, not God, but mind. You would have to separate this mind from just the very fabric of reality. Otherwise, you're just saying that this mind is the fabric of reality. In that case, some of your other arguments kind of fall by the wayside, like this mind wanting to share its love, or this mind wanting to grant us moral knowledge. Because as we all know, nature doesn't give a shit about any of us. It doesn't care about it. The universe, I think, is famously said on the meme, doesn't give a shit about you. This is plainly obvious through our experiences. So I think that I feel like you're just arbitrarily assigning this mind and saying that it's different from the fabric of reality without actually supporting that argument.
Okay. John, could you be wrong that you exist? Could you be wrong about your existence?
I mean, I don't know, maybe, I guess. I don't see how that helps us in our conversation.
There's a second question here. Okay, so I would say yes. I couldn't be wrong about my own existence. I think therefore I am, like René Descartes. I'm very certain about my existence. Could we be in the Matrix? Could this material world be an illusion and it's just a projection of something else?
How do you know you're not an NPC in another person's game?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's the question I'm asking. How do we know that there's a material? How do we know that there's a material world that exists independently of minds? How do we know that we're not just in the Matrix?
Well, this goes into the solipsism kind of area, and I really don't find solipsism all that helpful, because regardless of whether or not we are a brain in a vat or an NPC in somebody else's open world game, we're still presented with the reality that we experience. Like right now, I'm experiencing this live stream and us discussing God. Whether or not that's absolutely true outside of my experience, that doesn't really matter, because what we are experiencing right now is the thing that matters. So any conversation about solipsism or hard solipsism or anything like that really doesn't advance the conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. Solipsism is not a very attractive view, but I think you're missing my point a little bit here. So you were saying, okay, well, we just know that there's this material world that exists independently of minds through like scientific data and things like that. And I'm saying we need to take a step back for a second, because I'm saying, well, I think therefore I am. It seems just like I can't be wrong about my own existence. So it seems to me my mental experience is fundamental. Like I can't be wrong about my existence. Could I be wrong about this material world existing? It seems like I could. It seems very unlikely, but at least it seems like, I could be in the Matrix, or like this bed doesn't actually exist as like a material substance. Like it seems possible. So I'm just saying, like, it seems like mind, at least in some sense, is prior to matter. Because we could be wrong about the material world existing. We couldn't be wrong about our own selves existing. That's my point here.
Well, I mean, I kind of feel like you could be wrong about your own cells existing. If you are a brain in a vat or anything like that, then you're definitely wrong about having a physical body.
Yes, exactly. John, you're proving my point here. We could be wrong about the physical. Even if we're a brain in the vat, we still exist. It's just not in the way we think we do. So it seems like the mental experiences precede the physical.
Well, but my point is that we can only work with what we experience. So whether or not we're a brain in a vat,
start with experience. I like that. Start with experience,
because this is our experience.
Yes, I agree. I can like we should start with experience, our own mental experience. Like I think therefore I am, right? That's a great place to start. I agree. I totally agree with you here.
I don't understand how this helps your argument though. This just still seems to me like a kind of a non-starter.
Well, I was just responding to like you said this like assumption. Well, it's just obvious the material world exists independently of a mind. And I'm saying, well, hold on. We don't know that. We don't know that through our own experience. It seems like we can't be wrong about the mental,
but we do know that through our own experience. We have things like radiometric dating that allow us to peer into the past and know that, you know, all of this definitely existed absent of a mind. So, I mean, I feel like what you're saying here, and I might be wrong, but I feel like what you're saying is we think, and so therefore we are. And because of that, it means that there's definitely a mind that had to have existed, you know, in order for this universe to exist.
A little bit like I'm just like John, once again, I'm just responding to your argument that it's just obvious the material exists independently of a mind. I think through there being a necessary fact, and then we get to like things like all these different arguments, there's good reason to think that the necessary fact is a mind. I'm just responding to this idea that, well, it's just obvious the material world exists independently of a mind. And I'm just saying, well, we don't know that through our own experience. It just seems like we're making an assumption here that's ungrounded and it goes against like even like our own experiences.
Well, I would say that all the evidence that we currently have doesn't suggest that there were any minds in existence prior to life starting on our planet, which there definitely could have been minds that existed in this universe elsewhere, but we don't have evidence of that. So there's no reason to believe that. But I just don't see the evidence for just making the assumption that a mind had to have existed.
Okay. Well, I guess I can just respond to my closing to that. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate your time, John. It's been a lot of fun.
You guys have made my job as moderator very easy. Thank you.
I'll go full precept here. Don't worry.
All right.
Okay, I guess I'm going. I wasn't sure if Shane was going to introduce.
Yeah, I guess I don't really have to. Yeah, you guys have done great. Let's just get into the closings. I will say this. I want to test my abductive reasoning skills really quickly. Zach, have you read Meditations on Philosophy by Descartes?
I actually kind of. I've used it in a paper, so I've read parts of it, but I haven't read the whole thing yet. But it's very high on my reading list.
Because as somebody who recently read that book, I'm listening to you talk, and you didn't like copy his like art, hit him per se, like, but it just I was like, you know what? It seems like he has recently been influenced by this book that I just read. So okay,
I love Descartes. He's great.
Yeah, he is. All right. Anyway, who did they say was going first in the closing?
I imagine me because I did the affirmative.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hosting this debate, Tart. It's been so much fun. Like, I love these conversations, and I appreciate John for agreeing to debate and dealing with me talking a million miles an hour. It's been so much fun. I really enjoy these conversations, and I think it's just about like John's an atheist, I'm a theist, and disagree on a lot of things. I think we also agree on a lot of things, and I think it's good to come together, seek truth together. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. Just saying, you know, we don't agree, but we can look at this and try to figure this out together. So there's a lot of beauty in that. So I appreciate that. So I'm just going to run through my arguments and then go through John's, kind of giving comments on like the dialectic and like what we said and such. So first, my first argument was that there's a necessary fact. I think John would agree with that. And like, you know, maybe it's a quantum vacuum or initial state or something like that. And that's fine, you know, and I appreciate, and I think that's making progress saying that, you know, like maybe a theist and an atheist can agree on one thing. That'd be awesome. So I think we agree there's necessary facts. The question then is this necessary fact in mind? So we talked about the design argument, and it seemed like John's big sticking point, there are a couple of things, and it kind of went to this idea, well, the universe doesn't look designed because we have things like evolutionary evil or like a lifeless universe. And I would say, well, why not encourage people to check out this Josh Rasmussen paper on evolutionary evil? It's so good. So there's that. But then I also think that like, yes, of course there's like evolution, but you have to establish why this would be evidence against theism to some capacity and not just like consistent with like an atheistic naturalism. So that's one thing. And like with like the fine tuning, well then there's like, it seems like under like the atheistic hypothesis, where there's different universes where there's no life at all, which would count. Well, it seems like under the theistic hypothesis, we wouldn't have that. So it seems to grant some evidence to theism. The argument from arbitrary limits, I don't think we made a lot of progress here, but it was really fun to talk about. So like, once again, I just reiterate, like, it seems like if we're going to have a materialistic foundation, we're going to have some of these arbitrary limits where it's going to be like, maybe like 300 units of energy exist in this vacuum at this like particular like cubic shape because they had to. There's no further explanation. It's just this way. It wasn't 299. It could have been 301, but it just wasn't. It had to be this way. And all I want to point out is like the theistic hypothesis of a mind doesn't have these arbitrary limits. So it seems like in that capacity, theism is simpler. Arguments through reason and moral knowledge. We didn't talk about moral knowledge at all, but I'd be curious, like if you're an atheist, just think about this question. If evolutionary naturalism is true and moral knowledge is just a product of our evolutionary history, is it possible that we evolved in a way that some action like rape would be considered an acceptable activity? Because we see that in ducks. So I'd be curious, like, is there a possible world where because of like moral knowledge being based off evolution, rape is okay? So it's an interesting question. And the argument from reason, like I have no problem with it being evolutionary beneficial for certain things, like like not eating poisonous mushrooms to be like the right thing. But what I do think is the problem for the naturalist or for the atheist, I might be a naturalist by John's definition, but for the atheist is if hard atheism is true, your decision to believe in God or not God, or to type in that Zach is a crazy person who talks too fast or not, is totally determined by a source outside of yourself. Your choice to do these things wasn't determined by you. It was determined by some fundamental law governing yourself. Your thoughts were determined. Your actions were determined. It seems like under an atheistic, naturalistic, deterministic universe, everything we do is determined. So it seems like in that capacity, that's a bullet that you're going to have to bite. The intuitiveness of theism, we didn't talk about this at all, but it'd be really interesting to hear John's thoughts on it. It wasn't exactly what John said it'd be. It's the idea that theism is intuitive to most people. It's intuitive to most people that God exists, backed by scientific research, demographics, like anthropology, things like that. And there's no reason that God is non-existent or non-present. Therefore, God probably exists, just a Bayesian argument. And we should trust intuition unless there's good defeaters. So it seems like God probably exists based off of the intuitiveness of theism. And then we talked about the argument from consciousness. We didn't get into this too much, but I would say like the existence of mental states and like the existence of mental states is some evidence for theism. And like John talked about like the material world existing independently of the mind. What it seems like to me from my own experience, I could not be wrong about my mental experience. No, there's no where there's like in terms of contingency necessary.
Your internet cut out for a second. Could you say what you said? And to clarify, I'm laughing, but I'm not laughing at you, and I feel horrible for it. It's just something you said earlier, but when you brought up ducks, I don't know why that was funny to me. It was like, we see that in ducks. I am sorry. I'm not laughing at everything else you're saying. Please.
You're good. I appreciate it. So with like, I was getting into the argument from consciousness, and I'm saying we could not be wrong about our own mental states or our own existence. I could not be wrong about my own existence. And it seems like if you're listening to this, you could not be wrong about your mental existence. You could be wrong though about the physical world. It seems very unlikely to be true, but you could be in the matrix or a brain in the vat or something like that. So, but it seems like at least in that sense, our own mental our own mental existence is more fundamental than the physical existence. So it seems like to me, like John pointed out, it's obvious the physical existence of the mind isn't true from our own experience. Because we could be wrong about the physical world. We wouldn't be wrong about our own mental experience. And then I talked about like what best unifies the data. Remember, theism isn't saying, well, I don't know, let's throw God as the explanation. That's a terrible mistreatment of theism. That if you read like Alex Proust, Rob Koons, any of these Christian philosophers, you're not getting that. So like I highly encourage you, How Reason Can Lead to God by Jack Rasmussen, great introduction into like the best of theistic philosophy if you want to engage in the best of what theists are saying. So I'm arguing that a theistic explanation could unify things such as like design, contingent facts, moral knowledge, reason, intuitiveness of theism, and mental states, and pose no arbitrary limits. Theism can get all of these things explained into one fundamental hypothesis, a mind, whereas the naturalist is probably going to have to say, okay, well, there's fine tuning to some degree, but it's just necessary that it had to be the way that it was, or maybe it was just chance or something like that. And something like maybe moral knowledge or reason, maybe it's just a brute fact that we can get reason or moral knowledge out of just immaterial impersonal foundation. And it's just a brute fact like panpsychism for mental states to exist. So it seems like theism provides the best, most unified explanation of the data. And then with John's points, very briefly, the prior probability of theism. Well, I agree to him to some capacity if we were arguing, well, like this personal experience count as evidence for Christianity. I would say no, because it seems like, there's people that are Muslims that would have personal experiences and things like that. But that doesn't rule out the existence of a mind. You see, these people disagree about the specifics of like what this mind is like, but they're all unified in that there is this mind, this foundational mind. So it seems to me to count as some evidence for theism. The supernatural natural distinction really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, especially with like, no offense to John, like what John was saying, I don't get the supernatural natural distinction. It it doesn't add up. I could say like there's this big blob of everything, and that everything that exists in this big blob of reality is what exists. And if that's what is natural, then I'm a naturalist because I think the foundation is the mind. So there's that. And then I think we covered everything. It's been so much fun. I appreciate John. He's a great guy. I saw they did the like community thing for special people with special needs, and they raised like $600. That's awesome. So a lot of respect to you there, John. You're a great guy. It's been so much fun. And I've really enjoyed this debate and just seeking truth and exchanging ideas. And there's a quote I'll read from Dostoevsky to close this out from the brothers Karamazov. And in this quote, it says, above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him. And so he loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. And now you may read this quote and saying, well, isn't Zach just saying that atheists are just lying to themselves and obviously denying God's existence? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying just have an open mind. If you're an atheist or a theist, have an open mind. Be willing to be wrong. Keep questioning. Keep examining these things. Life's a beautiful gift, and we have this chance to really think about these deep questions of reality. So don't fall into a tribalism where everything John says is perfect or everything I says is perfect. Challenge both of our ideas. Seek truth, and I believe truth will win at the end of the day. And don't be afraid to seek truth, and don't forget to love and just appreciate the beauty of life. And never stop asking questions. Question everything. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you.
All right, awesome, especially the last thing he said. All right, I guess just go ahead with yours.
All right. Well, tonight I really appreciate Zach having this discussion with me and everything. The question of whether or not God exists is kind of one of the main themes of my channel. So I'm really grateful to get this opportunity to have this debate. But unfortunately, I didn't really hear any good evidence that suggests that a mind definitely exists and that it's more likely that it exists. I know. Well, one of the things that Zach mentioned was like this moral foundation, or allowing organisms to make moral choices and all this other stuff. To me, when I look at morality or reason or anything that or consciousness, what I see are biomechanical processes biochemical processes that are operating under the laws of physics and chemistry. I don't see the necessary need for a mind outside of everything to exist. While we can agree on some kind of fabric of reality that he wants to call a mind, in his presentation, in his opening and throughout our discussion, he kind of seemed to indicate a few specific definitions about this mind. Like this mind would want to impart his love on organisms that would exist in his universe and all this other stuff, or that this mind would want to give us a moral sense or give us consciousness and all this other stuff. That's going a bit beyond the general description of a deity and getting into, while still a very still not very specific, it's still more specific than just a general deity sort of figure. When you get into that kind of territory, you just simply don't have the evidence to suggest that mind would do that. You would have to know that mind's intent. While those seem like very good qualities to you that you would want to impart on organisms that you create, that doesn't necessarily mean that transcendental mind would also want those things. You would have to first establish that mind would want to do these things independent of how you view those things. I personally would think that if a mind did exist, there would be no reason for it to show any kind of love, especially if we're equating this mind with the very fabric of reality. The natural world, the fabric of reality doesn't really care what happens to us or anything like that. So it kind of seems like if you were to argue for a mind, you would only want to argue for a mind that just simply doesn't care about us whatsoever, because that actually matches what we experience in reality. I found the arguments presented here tonight were very dressed up versions of basic arguments that trace back to like Thomas Aquinas or other older arguments for God. And while they may be dressed up, with maybe more modern information concerning them, they still very basically reduce to like the first cause argument, and other cosmological arguments, the teleological arguments. All of the stuff just kind of resolves down to these very basic arguments for God, and I don't find them to be all that convincing. I still find that the natural world just, acting the way it always has acted, without any kind of indication of a mind or God figure that is required for them to operate. This world just operates like it does without the need for any kind of supernatural intervention or without a mind intervening in them. It seems to me like all of the evidence points towards like the fact that there's no mind that is required for anything in this universe. And maybe that's me thinking simplistically about it, but in any case, I would think that you would need to make a solid connection between the natural processes that govern this reality and this mind, and try to establish that these natural processes definitely require this mind in order for you to make the argument that this mind is more likely to exist than not. And I don't find the arguments presented here tonight accomplish that. So I'm sure that I missed plenty of arguments in this, but I am very interested to see if we've got any questions, or I don't know if we're doing a Q&A. Are we doing a Q&A?
I'm unaware of that.
Oh, okay. Maybe we're not doing a Q&A.
Maybe not.
But regardless, if anybody wants to send me comments or questions over on my YouTube channel, please do, or email me at john@godlessengineering.com, and you can ask me questions there, because I always love fielding these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I just want to say, Sam. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your closing statement. My bad. I apologize.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I was just going to say literally the same thing. Email me at adherentapologetics@gmail.com. I'd love to answer any of your questions. So I was just copying what John said because it was really good. So, yeah.
All right. I guess that'll be it for me and my closing statement. Appreciate everybody coming out. And I hope you heathens have a lovely Sunday.